On the evening of May 30th, 1431, the public executioner of Rouen walked into a Dominican friary and asked for two friars by name. Geoffroy Terrage had spent his career hanging thieves and burning heretics, and nothing about the work had ever seemed to bother him before. That evening he could not stop shaking. He found Martin Ladvenu and Isambard de la Pierre, the two men who had stood closest to the stake that morning, and he confessed to them that he was terrified of damnation. He said God would never pardon him for what he had done a few hours earlier in the old marketplace. He had burned a saint. Those were more or less his words, and both friars repeated them under oath 25 years later, along with a detail Terrage apparently could not get out of his head. The pyre had been built too high. He couldn't reach the girl to end it quickly, the way an executioner normally would, and so she had gone into the fire fully conscious, and he had listened to everything that came after. The girl was 19 years old. Her ashes had gone into the Seine that same afternoon on official orders so that nobody could ever collect a piece of her. Before we get into how a farm girl from a village most of France had never heard of ended up on that pyre, a quick hello, welcome, and thank you for being here. Do me one favor while you get settled. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from, city, country, whatever you're comfortable sharing. I go through every single one. Huge thank you as well to the Patreon supporters and the YouTube members. If you'd like to join them, the links to support the channel are down in the description and in the pinned comment. Alright, get comfortable, because this one is long, and it does not get easier as it goes. Joan was born around 1412 in a village called Domrémy on the banks of the river Meuse in the far northeast of France. Nobody wrote her birth down. Peasant births didn't get written down, and years later, when educated men in fur-lined robes demanded to know her exact age, she could only guess. About 19, she told them. That guess is the reason every biography of her has to say, circa. Her father was Jacques d'Arc, a farmer who worked about 50 acres and held a minor position in the village, collecting taxes and organizing the watch. Her mother was Isabelle, sometimes called Isabelle Romet, a name that may have come from a pilgrimage. The family lived in a stone house directly beside the parish church, close enough that the bells rang through the walls. Hold on to those bells. They come back later in a way nobody in that house could have predicted. The France she arrived into was in the process of tearing itself apart. 3 years after her birth, in October of 1415, an English army under Henry V annihilated the flower of French chivalry in a muddy field at Agincourt. Thousands of French noblemen died in an afternoon, many of them face down in the muck, drowned in their own armor, or stabbed through the visor slits by English archers who went around finishing the wounded with knives. Whole families of the French aristocracy were simply erased between breakfast and dinner. The kingdom never recovered its footing. The French king at the time, Charles VI, was insane, genuinely, clinically insane. He went through episodes where he forgot his own name, failed to recognize his wife and children, and at one point became convinced his body was made of glass, refusing to let anyone touch him in case he shattered. He had iron rods sewn into his clothing to protect himself. For months at a stretch, he refused to bathe or change his clothes. A country at war needed a king, and France had a man who screamed when his servants approached. Into that vacuum stepped two rival factions of the royal family, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, and they went after each other with a viciousness that makes the English almost look like a side problem. In 1419, the Duke of Burgundy was hacked to death on a bridge during what was supposed to be a peace negotiation. His skull split open in front of the Dauphin, the mad king's own son. The murder drove Burgundy straight into an alliance with England. A year later came the Treaty of Troyes, the document Joan's whole story grows out of. Under its terms, the mad king disinherited his own son. Charles, the Dauphin, was declared illegitimate, cut out of the succession, and the crown of France was promised to Henry V of England and his heirs. The Queen of France signed off on it, her own son, legally erased with a signature. Then, in 1422, both kings died within weeks of each other, and the throne of France passed, on paper, to an English baby. Henry VI was 9 months old. The disinherited Dauphin, Charles, retreated south of the Loire with whatever was left of his cause and set up a shadow court. His enemies mockingly called him the King of Bourges after the provincial town he governed from, a pretender ruling a rump of a country. He was broke, indecisive, surrounded by scheming favourites, and haunted by the possibility that the Treaty of Troyes was right about him. His own mother's conduct had been scandalous enough that people openly wondered whether he was actually the old king's son at all. The question of his legitimacy ate at him personally, well beyond the legal problem, and a teenage girl is going to walk into his castle in a few years and speak to that doubt directly. None of this was abstract for the people of Domrémy. The village sat on a frontier. Joan's community held for the Dauphin, for the Armagnac cause, while much of the surrounding countryside leaned Burgundian, and the boundary between those loyalties ran close enough that the boys of Domrémy fought actual fistfights with the boys of the next village over politics. Joan later said she saw children come home bleeding from those brawls. War in this period didn't mean armies meeting on battlefields, at least not usually. It meant the chevauchée, the mounted raid, soldiers and freelance brigands sweeping through farmland to take what they could and burn the rest, because ruining the enemy's peasants was cheaper than fighting the enemy's army. Crops burned in the fields while the livestock was driven off. Men who resisted were killed in their own doorways, and worse was done to the women. Bands of unemployed soldiers, the écorcheurs, the flayers, roamed the countryside between campaigns living off exactly this. A peasant family in the Rouen valley could lose everything they had ever worked for in one afternoon, and the law would do precisely nothing about it, because the law was busy elsewhere, and in many places the men committing the crimes were the law. That violence came to Joan's doorstep more than once. During her childhood, raiders drove off Domrémy's cattle, and around 1425, when she was roughly 13, an attack forced her family to abandon their home entirely and flee to the fortified town of Neufchâteau, about 8 miles away, where they sheltered at an inn until it was safe to come back. When they returned, part of the village had been burned, including, by some accounts, the church next to their house. She would have walked back into her own street smelling the char. A 13-year-old picking through what raiders had left of her neighborhood, and this was ordinary. This happened to villages all over France, every year, for decades. Historians estimate that between the war, the raiding, the famines that followed the raiding, and the waves of plague that never really stopped coming after 1348, France lost somewhere between a third and a half of its population across this long catastrophe. Entire regions went back to wilderness. Wolves moved into abandoned villages, and there are accounts from these decades of wolves entering Paris itself and taking people. The country Joan grew up in was a country being eaten alive, and everyone her age had known nothing else. Inside that world, she was, by every surviving account, an almost painfully ordinary girl. Neighbors from Domrémy testified about her decades later, and their memories are touchingly small. She spun wool with her mother. She did farm work, drove the animals when it was her turn, though she apparently bristled a little at being called a shepherdess, insisting she mostly worked in the house. She gave alms to the poor even though her family had little, and sometimes gave up her own bed so a homeless traveller could sleep in it while she slept on the hearth. The village children teased her for being too religious. When the bells rang and she was out in the fields, she would drop to her knees right there in the dirt. One neighbor remembered the sexton being lazy about ringing the evening bells, and Joan bribing him with little cakes to ring them properly. She was, in other words, a devout, hard-working, slightly odd peasant girl in a village of maybe a couple hundred people. And if the war had gone differently, she would have married a local farmer, raised children, and vanished from history without leaving a single trace of her existence. Instead, one summer day around 1425, in her father's garden, at around midday, she heard a voice. She was about 13. She described the moment herself, years later, under interrogation, with clerks writing down every word, and her account stayed consistent no matter how many ways they came at it. The voice came from the direction of the church, on her right side, and it arrived with a brightness, a great light, she said, coming from the same side. The first time it happened, she was frightened. That detail always stands out in her testimony. Whatever this was, her first reaction was fear, a 13-year-old alone in a garden, hearing something speak to her out of light. The voice told her at first only simple things, to be good and to go often to church. She heard it 2 or 3 times before. In her words, she knew it was the voice of an angel. Over the following months and years, the voices multiplied and took on names. Saint Michael the Archangel came first, appearing, she said, surrounded by other angels, and after him came 2 women, Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret. She said she saw them with her bodily eyes as clearly as she saw her judges, that she embraced them, that they smelled sweet, that their voices were beautiful. Both of those female saints, incidentally, were virgin martyrs whose statues and images stood in churches all around her region. Catherine of Alexandria, according to her legend, was tortured on a spiked wheel and beheaded for refusing to renounce her faith. Margaret of Antioch was tortured and beheaded as well, and was said to have escaped a dragon's belly by making the sign of the cross. Those were the companions of Joan's adolescence, two tortured virgins and a warrior angel, speaking to her several times a week, sometimes triggered, she said, by the ringing of church bells, the same bells that rang through the walls of her house. When the sexton skipped the evening ringing, she may have been missing more than the sound. You can sit with what that actually looked like from the outside. A girl kneeling alone in a field, or standing motionless in a garden, listening intently to nothing anyone else could hear. Modern doctors have offered plenty of retrospective diagnoses, and we'll get to those at the end. But the people around her at the time had a much simpler framework. Voices came either from heaven or from hell, and being wrong about which was a matter of eternal consequence. Joan told no one, kept it from her parish priest and her mother alike, and hid it above all from her father. For roughly 3 years, she carried this entirely alone, a teenager in a 2-room farmhouse keeping the biggest secret in France. And the voices escalated. Somewhere in those years, the instructions changed from be good and go to church into something no peasant girl had any business hearing. Go into France. Raise the siege of Orléans. Take the Dauphin to Reims and see him crowned. She protested to the voices, by her own account, that she was a poor girl who knew nothing of riding or making war. She said the voice told her God would help her. Sometime in this period, she also privately vowed her virginity to God, for as long as it pleased him, and began to think of herself in the terms she would later make famous. La Pucelle. The maid. When she finally set out, she would sign her letters that way, a title staking everything on her purity, and her purity is exactly what her enemies would eventually try hardest to destroy, in ways that had nothing to do with theology. Her father, meanwhile, was having dreams. Jacques d'Arc dreamed that his daughter would go off with soldiers, and in the world he lived in, a girl who went off with soldiers had exactly one future as a camp follower, a prostitute trailing an army. Joan herself told her judges what her father said about that dream, and the words are in the trial record. If he truly believed it would happen, he told her brothers, he would want them to drown her, and if they would not do it, he said, he would drown her himself. Her own father. She repeated this at her trial without apparent bitterness, as a plain fact about him, and you get the sense she understood exactly what he thought he was protecting her from. He kept a closer watch on her after that. Her parents pushed her toward marriage, and at some point a young man from the region actually took her to court in Toul, claiming she had promised to marry him. Joan, a teenager who had never left her valley, stood up in an ecclesiastical court by herself and swore she had made no such promise. She won the case. It is the first documented appearance of a pattern that runs through her entire life. Put her in front of hostile authority, and she does not fold. By May of 1428, she had run out of patience with waiting. The voices were pressing her, and the nearest outpost of the Dauphin's authority was a fortified town called Vaucouleurs, about 12 miles up the valley, commanded by a rough professional soldier named Robert de Baudricourt. Joan couldn't simply announce to her father that she was leaving to find the king, given his stated position on drowning, so she worked around him. She told her parents she was going to help a cousin near Vaucouleurs through a difficult childbirth, and it was that cousin's husband, her uncle by marriage, Durand Laxart, whom she first told the truth. Standing in his house, this 16-year-old told a grown man that she had to go to the Dauphin because it was her destiny to save France, and she talked him into taking her to the garrison commander. Laxart later testified about it with a sort of lingering astonishment, and he remembered her citing an old prophecy that circulated in the region, that France would be ruined by a woman and restored by a virgin from the borders of Lorraine. The ruinous woman, people understood, was the queen who had signed away her son at Troyes. Joan had apparently decided who the virgin was. Baudricourt's reaction went about how you'd expect. A grizzled captain holding a frontier town in a collapsing kingdom, and in walks a farm girl in a worn red dress, announcing that God has sent her to crown the true king. He told Laxart to take her back to her father and have her ears boxed, slapped essentially for wasting his time. Joan went home, and a few months later the war made her argument for her, because that autumn the English opened their siege of Orléans, the fortress city on the Loire that guarded the whole of the Dauphin's remaining territory. If Orléans fell, the south lay open, and the Dauphin's cause was finished. Word of the siege filtered even into the Meuse Valley, and Joan's voices, by her account, became insistent. She went back to Vaucouleurs in January of 1429, and this time she didn't go home. She lodged with a family in town and started telling anyone who would listen exactly what she intended to do. She had to reach the Dauphin before mid-Lent, she said, even if she wore her legs down to her knees walking there. Nobody in the world, she said, no king, no duke, no daughter of the King of Scotland could recover the kingdom of France. She was the only help there was, and she would rather have stayed home spinning wool beside her poor mother, for war was not her station. But she had to go, because her Lord willed it. People asked who her Lord was. God, she said, just like that. Something about her landed with the townspeople. They started to believe her before their commander did, and two of Baudricourt's own men of arms attached themselves to her cause. One of them, Jean de Metz, later described their first meeting. He found her in her red dress and asked, half joking, what she was doing there, whether the king was to be driven from his kingdom and everyone made English. Her answer converted him on the spot, and this was a serving soldier, a grown man of war. He put his hands between hers and swore, on his faith, that he would take her to the king. Then he asked when she wanted to leave. Sooner today than tomorrow, she said, sooner tomorrow than later. Baudricourt remained the obstacle, and he was suspicious of the exact thing everyone in this century would be suspicious of. If the girl heard voices, the voices might be devils. He arrived at her lodgings one day accompanied by the parish priest of Vaucouleurs, who came wearing his stole and performed what was essentially an exorcism right there in the room, commanding any evil spirit in her to depart and any good spirit to come forward. Joan knelt to the priest, but she was annoyed with him afterward on entirely reasonable grounds, as the man had heard her confession before and should have known better. Twice she was refused and pushed away, and she kept coming back. And then, in February, something happened that changed Baudricourt's mind. According to accounts from her circle, on or around February 12th, she told him the Dauphin's forces had that day suffered a defeat near Orléans, and that he needed to send her before things got worse. Days later, news arrived up the roads. On February 12th, a French and Scottish force had been badly mauled outside Orléans trying to intercept an English supply convoy, in a fight remembered as the Battle of the Herrings, after the barreled Lenten fish in the wagons. Hundreds of the Dauphin soldiers were dead in the fields around some wagons of herring. Whether Baudricourt weighed the coincidence or simply decided the situation was now desperate enough that a girl with voices could hardly make things worse, he gave in. The people of Vaucouleurs bought her a horse and equipped her, and here she made the choice that would eventually help kill her. For the journey, she cut her hair short like a man's and dressed entirely in men's clothing, tunic, hose, boots, the works, practical dress for 11 days of hard riding through enemy country. Baudricourt gave her a sword, 6 men as escort, and a farewell entirely in his style. "Go," he said, "and come what may." What came next was 350 miles through hostile territory, in winter, mostly at night. Her escort was small, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy with their servants, a royal messenger, an archer, riding through country thick with Burgundian patrols and freebooters, crossing rivers swollen with winter rain. The men later admitted they were afraid for most of it, and that at the start some of them quietly wondered whether the whole thing was folly. They slept rough in the open, fully clothed, and both de Metz and de Poulengy volunteered years later testimony about those nights that they clearly considered remarkable. They slept beside her, this 17-year-old girl lying in her clothes among soldiers, and neither man ever felt desire toward her. Not once, they swore, would they have dared approach her that way, and de Poulengy said there was something about her that simply extinguished the thought. Take that testimony however you like, but notice the baseline it reveals. These were her friends, her protectors, and the fact that they did not assault her on the road struck them and everyone listening as worth stating under oath. That was the world she had volunteered to travel through. 11 days out from Vaucouleurs, having heard mass where they safely could and forded what they had to ford, the little party rode into the town of Chinon, below the great castle on the ridge where the disinherited Dauphin was keeping his threadbare court. Joan took a room at an inn and sent word up the hill. She had come 150 leagues to speak with him, and she had things to tell him that would change his life. The court made her wait 2 days while they argued about whether to see her at all, and you can understand the hesitation. Charles's position was so fragile that a wrong step could sink him. If he received a peasant visionary and she turned out to be a fraud or a witch, his enemies would feast on it forever, and his enemies already whispered that his cause was cursed. On the other hand, the man was desperate. Orléans was slowly strangling, his treasury was empty, and one story from these years claims a Scottish archer once found the future King of France pawning his own armour. Eventually, curiosity, or desperation, won, and on an evening in late February or early March of 1429, Joan was escorted up the hill, through the gates, into the great hall of Chinon, lit by dozens of torches and packed with several hundred courtiers who had all turned out to watch the show. Then comes one of the most famous scenes in French history, and the sources really do describe something strange happening in that room. Charles, by several accounts, had positioned himself away from the dais, dressed more plainly than the men around him, blended into the crowd either as a test or as a precaution. Joan walked into a hall full of richer, taller, more royal-looking men, moved through them and went straight to him. She knelt and addressed him as the man God had sent her to. He deflected, pointing to another courtier, saying that man was the king. She wasn't having it. "In God's name, gentle prince," she told him, "it is you and no other." However you explain it, informants describing him beforehand, a lucky guess, or something else, the room noticed and the story spread. What happened next mattered even more, and to this day, nobody knows exactly what it was. Charles drew her aside, and they spoke privately, and she told him something, a secret, a sign. And witnesses said that when the Dauphin turned back to the room, his face had changed. He was radiant, one said, as though something had been lifted off him. Joan flatly refused, for the rest of her life, to tell anyone what she said, including her judges, including under threat of torture. The most common later account holds that she spoke to the thing that gnawed at him privately, his fear that he was a bastard with no right to the throne, and assured him, on God's behalf, that he was the true heir. Whatever the words were, they bought her the thing she needed most. The Dauphin didn't dismiss her. An army was still a long way off, though. First came the theologians, and honestly, handing her to them was the shrewdest move available to him. For roughly 3 weeks at Poitiers, a panel of learned churchmen loyal to his cause examined her, questioning her about her voices and her mission, probing for any trace of fraud or the devil. The full record of those sessions is lost, and its disappearance frustrates historians, but fragments and recollections survive. One examiner pressed her on why God would need soldiers at all if God willed France delivered. "In God's name," she answered, "the soldiers will fight, and God will give the victory." Another, a friar with a regional accent, asked what dialect her voices spoke. "A better one than yours," she shot back. Asked for a sign to prove her claims, she refused to perform tricks. "Take me to Orléans," she said, "and I will show you the sign I was sent for." In the end, the clerics produced a carefully hedged report. They had found no evil in her, only goodness, humility, devotion, honesty, and simplicity. And given the desperation of the kingdom, the king would be within reason to make trial of her. The report amounted to permission to gamble and nothing warmer. One more examination ran alongside the theological one, and it was considerably more invasive. The claim at the center of her identity, the maid, had to be physically verified. So a committee of high-ranking women, presided over by the Dauphin's formidable mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, examined Joan's body to confirm her virginity. A teenage farm girl, stripped and inspected by duchesses, her hymen a matter of state. She would undergo this at least twice in her life, once for her friends and once, later, for her enemies, and both times the examiners reached the same conclusion. She was intact. In the logic of the 15th century, this carried real evidentiary force, since learned opinion held that the devil could not compact with a true virgin. Her body was submitted essentially as a character witness, and it passed. With the clerics satisfied and the gamble approved, the transformation began, and it moved fast. A full suit of plate armor was made for her at the king's expense, white harness, unadorned polished steel, fitted to a teenager. A household formed around her, squires, pages, a chaplain, her own military staff. Her two brothers, Jean and Pierre, came from Domrémy and joined her, so the family's position had clearly evolved since the drowning threats. She sent to the church of Sainte Catherine de Fierbois, where she had heard Mass on the road to Chinon, saying a sword lay buried behind the altar, and instructed that it be dug up. The clergy there dug and found one, an old sword, its blade eaten with rust that reportedly fell away at a touch. Make of that what you will. She carried it, though she always said she loved her banner 40 times more than the sword, and the banner was the point. White cloth sewn with lilies, painted with an image of Christ in judgment, and the names Jesus Maria. And she carried it herself, in the front of every assault to come, so her hands would be full of flag instead of weapons. She said, later, that she had never killed anyone. She marched at the head of armies for a year and put her body in the worst places on the worst days. And by her own account, she never personally took a life. That distinction sat at the center of how she understood herself, and the men around her seemed to have grasped it. She was the standard. You followed the standard. Something else changed as the army gathered around her at Blois, and hardened soldiers testified about it later with what still comes through as disbelief. She cleaned them up. This girl ordered the prostitutes driven out of the camp, chasing at least one away herself, sword in hand, by some accounts breaking the blade on another occasion, doing exactly this, to the king's annoyance. She demanded the men confess their sins and give up their looting and blasphemy. The oath-taking of one commander, the fearsome mercenary La Hire, was apparently so foundational to his personality that Joan negotiated him down to a compromise, allowing him to swear by his baton. Men who tortured prisoners for sport lined up for confession because a farm girl told them to. Priests marched at the head of the column singing hymns. Whatever else was happening here, an army that had spent a generation losing was being handed something it had entirely run out of, and call it faith or morale or myth, but it visibly starts to move. Orléans, meanwhile, had been dying by inches since October. The English had arrived before its walls in 1428 and begun ringing the city with siege forts, cutting the roads one by one, and the campaign's opening weeks had already produced one of the nastier deaths of the entire war. The English commander, Thomas Montague, Earl of Salisbury, one of the most experienced soldiers England had, climbed a captured tower by the river to survey the city's defences. As he stood at a window, a cannon shot from the walls of Orléans struck the window itself, and the impact blew stone and iron fragments into his face. Accounts differ on the precise horror, some saying a fragment tore away part of his cheek and eye, others that it carried off much of one side of his face entirely. He didn't die there. That was the cruelty of it. He was carried away and lingered for about a week, a mangled thing being tended in a nearby town, before the wound finished him. The men of the period held artillery wounds in a special dread, and Salisbury's window explains it. A sword kills you or it doesn't. A cannonball at the wrong window unmakes your face and gives you 7 days to think about it. Inside the walls, roughly 20,000 people were learning what a blockade does to a city over a winter. Supplies thinned, prices climbed. Every convoy that failed to slip through meant tighter rations, and the defeat at the Herrings in February had crushed morale so badly that serious voices inside the city discussed surrendering to the Duke of Burgundy just to escape the English. Yet the blockade leaked, and one leak in January has always stuck with people who study this siege. On the 3rd of that month, drovers pushed a herd right through a gap in the English lines and into the city. 154 pigs and 400 sheep, hooves clattering in through the eastern gate. Livestock walking casually through a siege makes the underlying problem plain. The English never had enough men to seal a city this size, maybe 4,000 or 5,000 troops trying to strangle a place whose circuit of walls they couldn't fully invest. They were holding it shut with reputation as much as force. Reputation, after Agincourt and a decade of victories, was doing a great deal of work. The French had stopped believing they could beat English armies, and that belief did more to keep the gates of Orléans shut than any of the forts did. Into that situation, Joan rode on the evening of April 29, 1429, entering the city through the leaky eastern side with a supply convoy on a white horse in her white armour, banner in hand, while what sounds like most of the population of Orléans crushed into the streets to see her. A city chronicle describes the crowd pressing so close, so desperate to touch her, or even her horse, that a torch in the mob set the fringe of her banner alight, and she calmly spurred her horse and turned it, crushing out the flame herself with a horseman's ease nobody expected from a girl raised at a spinning wheel. The city treated the little moment like a wonder. People this starved for hope will take it in any form it arrives, and she seems to have understood what the city was truly starved for. They needed to look at her. She had already opened her campaign before ever touching a weapon, by dictation. From Blois she had sent the English a letter, and it survives, addressed to the King of England, the Regent Bedford, and the commanders before Orléans. It orders them, in the name of the King of Heaven, to hand over the keys of every good town they had taken in France, and to go home, or the Maid would come upon them and make such a ha-hay, such an uproar, as had not been seen in France in 1,000 years. She offered peace first. She always offered peace first. Every assault of her career opened with a summons to withdraw, and she meant every word of the offer. Her judges would eventually wave this letter at her as evidence of bloodthirst and pride. The English on the walls answered her heralds with obscenities. They called her a cowgirl and a whore, and shouted that they would burn her if they caught her. Sit with that. Burn her. From the very first exchange, before a single one of them had fought her, that was the word they reached for. The fighting, when it came fast and ugly. On May 4th, French forces attacked the isolated English fort of Saint-Lô, east of the city, and the assault was already grinding when Joan, who by several accounts had been resting and woke suddenly declaring that French blood was being spilled, armed herself and galloped for the fighting. Her page had to be scolded for not waking her. She arrived to find the assault faltering, wounded men streaming back, and she rode into the retreat with the banner and turned it around, and the fort was stormed. What followed inside was the standard grammar of storming a fort in this war, meaning the garrison was largely butchered where it stood. Somewhere between 100 and 140 English soldiers died at Saint-Lô, many of them cut down after the walls were breached, when resistance had collapsed and killing had become momentum. A handful survived, some reportedly because they had wrapped themselves in church vestments looted from the priory the fort was built around, and the French either honoured the costume or found it funny enough to spare them. Joan wept afterward. That detail comes through in multiple accounts of her career. that after actions she would weep at the sight of the dead, and she wept at Saint-Lô specifically over the men who had died without confession. She had just won her first battle, and her reaction was grief that the enemy had gone into eternity unshriven. The men around her had never fought beside anything like this in their lives. 2 days later, the French crossed the river and went after the forts guarding the southern approach. On May 6th, they took the fortified monastery of Les Augustins, another brutal close assault that swung when Joan and La Hire charged into a wavering fight, and by nightfall the English survivors had been pushed back into the last and strongest position they held on that bank, Les Tourelles, a stone gate fortress standing on the bridge over the Loire itself, supported by an earthwork barbican held by several hundred of the best English troops under a captain named William Glasdale. Glasdale had personal history with Joan by this point. He was one of the ones who had screamed insults at her across the water, and she had answered, telling him he called her whore now, but would die soon, without ever laying a hand on her. Everyone in both armies knew the next day would decide the siege. Joan told her chaplain that evening to stay close to her tomorrow, for she would have much to do, more than she had ever had, and that blood would come out of her body above her breast. The words were remembered and written down, and you can decide for yourself what to do with a prediction like that, recorded by people who insisted she made it the night before it happened. The assault on Les Tourelles began at dawn on May 7th and ran for roughly 13 hours, and medieval assaults on fortified positions were among the worst places a human being could be. The attackers had to cross open ground under crossbow and longbow fire, descend into the defensive ditch, and climb scaling ladders while the defenders above dropped stones, poured whatever they had heated, and thrust down with spears at men whose hands were occupied with climbing. Bodies accumulated in the ditch as the morning wore on, and men climbing later in the day were stepping over the dead and the screaming wounded of the earlier waves to reach the same ladders. Joan spent the morning where she always put herself, at the edge of the ditch with the banner, calling men forward. At some point she seized a ladder and set it against the rampart herself, and as she started up, an English archer on the wall above put an arrow into her at a range where longbow shot goes through oak. The arrow struck between her neck and shoulder, above the breast, exactly where she had said, punching through the plate and driving into her body. Accounts of the depth vary, with some saying it penetrated a half-foot, and at least one claiming the head came out the other side of her shoulder. She went down off the ladder into the ditch, and English soldiers came over the wall to take her, alive being the obvious preference, given what they had been promising to do with her, and her own men fought over her body and dragged her out of the press. Away from the fighting, they got the armor off her, and here the record gives us one of those moments where the legend cracks open and a teenager looks out. She cried, seeing the arrow standing in her own flesh and the blood sheeting down. She was afraid, and she wept, 17 years old, and the soldiers around her responded like soldiers, offering the standard field medicine of the century, charms. Someone proposed laying a spell on the wound. She refused it flat, saying she would rather die than sin against God with witchcraft, and let them treat it the one way she would trust. The arrow drawn out of her body by hand, olive oil and lard packed into the hole, a dressing bound over it, and her confession heard while they worked. Then she rested through the afternoon, and up on the walls the English, having watched the witch fall with an arrow in her, told each other it was finished. By evening, the French commanders thought so too. The assault had been bleeding out all day against those walls. Casualties were terrible, the light was failing, and the order went out to sound retreat. Joan asked them to wait. "Give her a little time," she said, and she withdrew from the army, alone, into a vineyard. A wounded girl kneeling in the vines in the dusk, praying for about a quarter of an hour. What she said there, nobody knows. When she came back, she took up the banner and carried it to the edge of the ditch. And the army, watching the girl they had seen shot through the shoulder that morning standing at the ditch with the flag up, came off the leash entirely. The assault that followed carried the Barbican. The English abandoned the earthwork and crowded back across a drawbridge toward the stone towers. And while all this was happening, the citizens of Orléans had run a burning barge under that drawbridge from the city side, so that the timbers were on fire beneath the retreating garrison. Glasdale, the man who had called her whore, was on that bridge, in full armor, with flames under him when it gave way. He went into the Loire, and plate armor performs in deep water exactly the way you'd think. Joan watched from the far bank as the man drowned, dragged straight down by 60 pounds of steel, and witnesses say she wept for him, and for the other armored men who went into the river around him and called out to him as he went under. Classidas, she called him, the French mangling of his name, begging him to yield to the King of Heaven. He had promised to burn her. She cried while the water closed over him. Somewhere between 300 and 400 of the defenders of Les Tourelles died that day on the walls, in the towers, or in the river, and the bridge into Orléans was open by dark. She came back into the city that night through streets gone mad with bells and torches, with a hole in her shoulder that was 7 hours old. The next morning, May 8th, the remaining English forces on the north bank came out of their forts and formed up in battle order in the open fields, offering battle. The French army came out and formed up facing them, and then Joan did something that surprised her own side. She refused to attack. May 8th was a Sunday, and she would not fight on a Sunday unless attacked, so the two armies simply stood there facing each other across the field, close enough to see faces. For the better part of an hour, she had an altar set up and mass sung in front of the troops. Then the English turned and marched away, abandoning the siege, and she let them go. 200 days of siege ended with the attackers walking off unmolested while the defenders held a church service in a field. The city has celebrated May 8th every year since, and it still does, 6 centuries on. 9 days of Joan had accomplished it. From this point forward, everything in her story accelerates, and the same momentum that lifts her is going to run her, in barely a year, straight into the hands of the people who had been shouting from those walls about fire. The court argued for a month about what to do with the victory, and Joan spent that month pushing a single idea at the Dauphin with the persistence of a dripping tap. Reims. He had to be crowned at Reims, where French kings had been anointed with sacred oil since Clovis. The crown on paper meant nothing until God had visibly touched the man. Reims sat deep in enemy-held territory, and the cautious men around Charles preferred safer objectives, so the compromise was a summer campaign to clear the Loire Valley first, under the young Duke of Alençon, with Joan effectively co-commanding. Alençon deserves a moment here. He was in his 20s, had spent 5 years as an English prisoner after being captured at a battle where his father's generation was slaughtered, and had beggared his family paying the ransom. He and Joan became genuinely close. He called her his fair one, and his later testimony about her is some of the warmest on record. One of the odder details of her career comes from him too. Alençon, along with others, testified that although she was a girl who had never trained at anything, she handled war horses, couched a lance, and above all, placed artillery like a captain with decades behind him. The gunner's art, deciding where to sight the killing machines, was the most technical skill in this era's warfare, and the men who had spent their lives at it kept catching themselves taking direction from a teenager. The Loire campaign opened at Jargeau in mid-June, a walled town east of Orléans, held by around 700 English under the Earl of Suffolk. The French bombardment included a huge gun the men of Orléans had nicknamed the Shepherdess, in Joan's honour, and it brought one of the town's towers down. During a pause, Suffolk offered to surrender in 15 days if not relieved. Joan's counteroffer captures her entire style of war. They could leave now, immediately, in their tunics, with their lives, and otherwise the town would be stormed. They stayed. On June 12th, she was on a scaling ladder against the wall, banner in hand, when a defender above heaved a stone down onto her head. The stone burst apart on her helmet and knocked her clean off the ladder to the ground, and everyone nearby surely assumed for a heartbeat that the story ended there, a girl in the ditch with a shattered skull. Then she got up. The helmet had held, and she came up off the ground shouting for the assault. "Friends, friends, up and at them, our Lord has doomed the English," and Jargeau came apart. What happened inside a stormed town then took its usual course. Several hundred of the 700 defenders were killed, many in the streets after the walls had already failed, and the prisoners nearly weren't spared either, since a fight broke out among the captors over ransoms. Suffolk himself, cornered on the bridge, faced a young French squire and demanded to know whether the man was a knight, since an Earl of England could hardly surrender to a nobody. The squire admitted he wasn't. Suffolk knighted him on the spot, right there in the wreck of the battle, then handed him his sword. Etiquette held firm while men bled out in the gutters around it. Beaugency's garrison surrendered within the week, and the bridge at Meung fell in an afternoon, and then, on June 18th, came the field battle the English had actually wanted all along. A relief army under Sir John Fastolfe had joined the retreating garrisons, and near a village called Patay, the combined English force turned to make a stand, planning the formula that had butchered French armies for 80 years. Pick the ground, plant a hedge of sharpened stakes, put the longbowmen behind it, and invite the French cavalry to impale itself. It had worked at Crécy, it had worked at Agincourt. Joan, asked before the battle what would happen, told the commanders to ride boldly, that the English would be beaten, and that they would need good spurs, not to flee, she clarified, but to chase. The prophecy came in on schedule through an accident of the hunt. As the English archers were still deploying into cover, still hammering in their stakes, a stag blundered out of the woods and ran through their position, and the archers, unable to help themselves, sent up a hunting cry. The French vanguard heard it, found the position, and charged before the stakes were set. What followed stopped being a battle within minutes and became a harvest. Longbowmen wore little or no armor. That was the entire economy of the weapon. Cheap men killing expensive men from a distance, and once armored cavalry got in among them with the stakes down, the distance was gone. The French men-at-arms rode through the archery and killed, and kept killing, lances first and then swords and maces on the runners, riding men down in the open wheat, and the chroniclers who tried to convey it reached for the language of the slaughterhouse. English losses at Patay ran somewhere north of 2,000 men, the bulk of them archers, against French losses that the records put at around 100, and some accounts claim far fewer. A generation of English archery, the actual instrument of Agincourt, was wiped out in an afternoon of revenge that the French had been dreaming about for 80 years. The senior English commanders, Talbot included, were captured and ransomed, for capturing lords was profitable. Archers had no ransom value, nobody bought a bowman back. So the ordinary men were simply killed where they were caught, hundreds of individual endings scattered across a mile of trampled grain, and Joan, coming up with the main body after the vanguard had done most of it, rode into the aftermath rather than the fight. One scene from that evening was remembered and set down. A French soldier herding English prisoners struck one of them, a wounded man, over the head so viciously that the man went down dying in the road, and Joan got off her horse and went to him. She held the dying Englishman's head, this enemy soldier, dying of a casual cruelty after the battle was already won, and she stayed with him, comforting him until a priest could be brought and the man had gone. That's at Patay too, alongside the 2000. Both things happened in the same few hours, and any honest account of her has to hold both. With the English field army broken, the road northeast lay open, and the march to Reims turned into something closer to a procession than a campaign. Town after town that had spent years under Anglo-Burgundian control looked at the approaching army, at the girl riding at the front of it, and opened their gates. Auxerre negotiated. Troyes, the town where the treaty disinheriting Charles had been signed, hesitated behind its walls until Joan began ostentatiously preparing an assault, directing the placement of guns and fascines with such conviction that the citizens decided their treaty loyalties were negotiable after all. Châlons simply surrendered, and outside its walls a small delegation from Domrémy was waiting, farmers who had travelled to see the local girl. One of them was a man Joan quietly told something strange. She said she feared nothing but treason, half the kingdom kneeling to her, and that was the sentence she gave a neighbour from home. Reims opened its gates on July 16th, and the coronation was thrown together overnight since nobody wanted to give the enemy time to react. On the morning of July 17th, 1429, in the Cathedral of Reims, Charles was anointed with the sacred oil and crowned King Charles VII of France. Joan stood in the cathedral through the hours of ceremony, in her armour, holding her banner, the only woman and the only commoner given such a place, and when it was over she knelt at the new king's feet, embraced his knees, and wept. "Gentle king," she said, "now is accomplished the pleasure of God, who willed that I should raise the siege of Orléans and bring you to this city of Reims to receive your holy anointing, showing that you are true king, and that the kingdom of France belongs to you." Grown men around her were crying too, according to the accounts. 17 weeks. She had left Vaucouleurs in February with 6 men, and it was July, and the disinherited pretender was standing under the vaults of Reims as the anointed of God, which no English legal document could now undo in the eyes of ordinary French people. Her parents, incidentally, were in Reims that day. The town's accounts show the city paid the lodging bill at an inn for Jacques d'Arc, the man who had once promised to drown her. History doesn't record what father and daughter said to each other. I'd give a lot for that conversation. At the absolute summit of all this, with towns surrendering to her name and crowds mobbing her for a touch of her ring, people around her started asking whether any of it frightened her, and one exchange survives because a churchman recorded his own question. Given that she kept charging into places where anyone else would die, did she not fear death? She answered that she feared only treason, and, on another occasion, that she would last a year, hardly more, and that the king should think hard about how to use that year. She was keeping a private countdown. She told people, more than once, in the middle of the greatest triumph any peasant in European history had ever engineered, that her time was about 1 year, and from the coronation at Reims to the walls of Compiègne runs 10 months. The unravelling started almost immediately, and it started with her own side. Charles, anointed now and therefore satisfied, fell back into the hands of advisers who preferred diplomacy, above all a slippery favourite named La Trémoille, who began negotiating truces with Burgundy while the army that wanted to march on Paris sat and rotted. The Duke of Burgundy used the truce talks to reinforce Paris. Everyone with eyes could see it happening, and Joan, whose entire method was momentum, was made to wait through most of August while her window closed. When the attack on Paris finally came, on September 8, 1429, it went in against a city that had spent the gift of time digging in, and whose largely Burgundian population had been told by their preachers that the creature outside the walls was a devil in woman's shape come to burn Paris and its people. Paris was the largest city in Western Europe, its walls immense, its moats doubled, one dry ditch and behind it a wet one, wide and deep. Joan went at the Saint-Honoré gate. She crossed the dry ditch and stood on the ridge between the two moats, in the open, under the walls of the most heavily defended city in the realm, testing the depth of the water-filled ditch with the shaft of a lance and shouting up at the defenders to surrender Paris to the King of France. She stood there doing this while crossbowmen on the wall above shot at her deliberately, and one of them found her. A crossbow bolt went through her thigh. A crossbow at wall range drives a bolt through oak boards, and it went through the meat of her leg, and she went down on the ridge between the moats and stayed. She refused evacuation. Lying wounded in the ditch of Paris as the afternoon failed, she kept calling the assault forward, insisting the place could be taken, while men died around her in the falling dark, the day's casualties among the French running into the hundreds, some accounts saying 500 dead and 1,000 wounded. Finally, at some point in the night, commanders physically carried her out of the ditch against her explicit will. She wanted to go back at dawn. Instead, orders arrived from the king. Withdraw. Charles pulled the army off Paris after 1 day, and within a fortnight he had disbanded it altogether and retreated to the Loire, and Joan, who had promised the crowds and very possibly herself that God's momentum was carrying them, had to limp away from her first defeat with a hole in her leg and a court whispering that the voices had apparently stopped delivering. Her enemies noted the date of the Paris attack with relish. September 8th, the feast of the Virgin's Nativity. The witch had shed blood in an assault on a holy day, and clerks in Paris and elsewhere quietly wrote it down, and 18 months later she would hear about it in a courtroom. The autumn and winter that followed were a long diminishment. The court gave her small errands instead of a war. She took the town of Saint-Pierre-le-Moutier in November, in an assault where, at the moment of crisis, almost everyone retreated and left her nearly alone at the wall, and a squire who ran to drag her back asked why she was still standing there. She took off her helmet and told him she was not alone, that she had 50,000 of her people around her, and that she would not leave until the town was taken. He looked, he later testified, and counted 4 or 5 men near her. The town fell. Then came the siege of La Charité in December, underfunded, undersupplied, conducted in freezing weather, begging letters going out to nearby towns for powder and money, and after a month of misery in the cold, the siege simply collapsed and was abandoned, guns left behind in the mud. Her aura of invincibility, already cracked at Paris, took another visible hit. That same December, the king ennobled her and her entire family, an extraordinary honor. The peasant house of Arc raised to the nobility with the name d'Ulysse, of the lily, and the timing carries its own commentary. He was decorating her. You decorate people you are done using. Spring of 1430 brought the years fighting back, and with the court still chasing a truce that Burgundy had no intention of honoring, Joan essentially went to war on her own initiative, riding north in April with a company of a few hundred to help the towns that were begging the king for aid and getting silence. The town in the crosshairs was Compiègne, north of Paris, loyal to Charles, and now besieged by a Burgundian army. Along the road at Lagny, her company caught a notorious Burgundian freebooter named Franquet d'Arras, a mercenary captain whose band had been robbing and killing through the region, and after a trial of sorts he was beheaded, and her enemies filed that away too, the maid handing a prisoner over to execution. Also at Lagny came a stranger episode people would later question her about. A baby, dead 3 days, was brought to the church where she was, unbaptized, and an unbaptized infant was believed barred from heaven, damned by default, and the local girls begged her to pray. She prayed with them, and by the accounts, the black-faced little corpse yawned, showed color, was baptized, and then died again, properly this time, admissible to paradise. She told the story herself at her trial, carefully, claiming nothing for her own power. Take from it whatever you like. The people of Lagny took it as a resurrection granted just long enough for a baptism, and it travelled ahead of her, and so did the darker interpretation her enemies preferred, that the witch toyed with the dead. During Easter week that April, at Melun, standing by the town's moat, the voices told her something new. She would be taken, captured before St. John's Day, midsummer, and she should accept it without astonishment, and God would help her. She asked her voices, she said later, to let her die quickly instead, rather than face long imprisonment. The answer was only that it had to be, and that she should take it graciously. From that week on, by her own account, she deferred to the captains more than before, no longer sure which day was the day. She was 14 months from her first meeting with the Dauphin, and 18 years old, and she spent that spring waiting to be caught. The day was May 23rd, 1430. She slipped into besieged Compiègne at dawn with reinforcements, and that same evening led a sortie out across the bridge over the Oise against the Burgundian camp at Marny. The raid went in well, then Burgundian reinforcements arrived faster than anyone had planned for, including a large English contingent, and the sortie turned into a fighting retreat back toward the bridge and the town gate. Joan did what she always did in a retreat and put herself at the back of it, in the rear guard, the most dangerous place, holding the pursuers off the fleeing men. The crowd of retreating soldiers jammed at the bridge and the gate. The pursuit pressed into them, and then the men inside Compiègne, watching enemies closing on the entrance, raised the drawbridge and dropped the portcullis, with her still outside. Whether the governor panicked or made a cold defensive calculation, or something worse, has been argued about ever since, and nothing was ever resolved. What's certain is the gate shut, and Joan was trapped on the wrong side of it with a handful of men, in a field filling with enemies who all recognized the banner. They swarmed her. A Burgundian chronicler who talked to men who were there describes a crowd of soldiers converging on her at once, grabbing at her, everyone screaming at her to yield, and Joan refusing, still fighting to break free, until an archer, described as a rough and spiteful man, furious that a woman had humiliated so many brave soldiers, got a grip on her long cloth of gold surcoat and hauled her bodily off her horse. She hit the ground flat, and it was over. Consider that surcoat, an ornamental golden robe worn over armor and drag on a battlefield. She was pulled to her death in a real sense by her own flag brightness, by the visibility she had built everything on. The men who took her practically rioted with joy. Prisoners of her rank of fame came along once in a lifetime, and the chronicler says they celebrated as though they had taken a king. Word moved across Europe within days, and the reactions map the whole board. In Paris, the English-aligned university wrote within a week, demanding the witch be handed over for trial. The Duke of Burgundy went to look at her in person, a duke visiting a farm girl in custody, and whatever passed between them, his letters that evening crowed about the capture of the woman called the Maid. In the French-held towns, people wept in the streets and held processions, and from the king whose crown existed largely because of her, from Charles VII, anointed at Reims with her standing beside him, came nothing. A ransom offer never materialized, an exchange of prisoners was never proposed, even though the French held English captains worth trading, and no embassy or letter on her behalf survives anywhere. Ransom was the ordinary machinery of this war. Everyone bought everyone back. Alençon had been bought back. Talbot would be bought back, and the machinery in her case simply never engaged. Some of his circle reportedly muttered that she had grown proud, that God was correcting her. The Archbishop of Reims, the very man who had performed the coronation, wrote to his flock that Joan had been taken through her own willfulness, that she would not take counsel and did her own pleasure, essentially blaming her for her own capture within weeks of it. A shepherd boy visionary was briefly promoted at court as her potential replacement, since apparently the position of God's messenger to France was now considered a staffable role. The boy ended badly too. The English later caught him, sewed him in a sack, and drowned him in the Seine. Joan spent that summer and autumn as the prisoner of Jean de Luxembourg, a Burgundian noble who held her first at Beaulieu and then at his castle of Beaurevoir, and by the customs of the age this was the gentle phase of her captivity, an aristocratic household, with de Luxembourg's own wife and aunt taking a protective interest in her. The two ladies begged her to stop wearing men's clothing, offering to make her dresses themselves, and she refused gently, saying she didn't yet have leave from God. She also tried to escape, at Beaulieu, by slipping between the planks of her cell toward the guard room, planning to lock her guards in, and got caught by a porter at the last door. At Beaurevoir, she did something far more drastic. The negotiations to sell her to the English were an open secret in the household, and word had also reached her that Compiègne, still under siege, was expected to fall, and that everyone in it above the age of 7, the report ran, would be put to the sword and fire. Her voices, she said, forbade her to leap from the tower. St. Catherine told her nearly every day by her account not to do it, that God would help her and the people of Compiègne. And for once, for the only documented time in her life, she disobeyed the voices. She went off the top of the tower of Beaurevoir, a drop the sources put at 60 or 70 feet without a rope. Whatever she intended, escape against impossible odds or something bleaker, the fall should have killed her, and she seems to have half expected it to. She had said, when the voices argued with her, that she would rather surrender her soul to God than her body to the English, and she said something else that stays with you, that if Compiègne burned, she would rather die than live on after such a destruction of good people. They found her at the base of the tower unconscious, and when she came around she could not eat or drink for days, and she had broken nothing. 60 feet or more onto the ground or into the soft earth of a dry moat, and the injury inventory was concussion and bruising, and everyone involved seems to have privately filed the survival in the same mental drawer as the rest of her. When she recovered, her voices, she said, told her Compiègne would be relieved before winter, and she confessed her disobedience and was, in her understanding, forgiven. Compiègne, as it happens, held. It was relieved that autumn. She heard about it in captivity, and it may be the last unambiguously good news she ever received, because in November the deal finally closed. Jean de Luxembourg, leaned on by his English patrons and reportedly against the tearful protests of his own wife, sold Joan to the English crown for 10,000 livres, a sum in the range of a prince's ransom, money the English raised through a special tax on occupied Normandy. The French purse had stayed shut while the English emptied theirs, and one of the men handling the transaction knew perfectly well what the money meant. This purchase, an observer noted, resembled no ordinary ransom of war, since no ransom was ever intended. They bought her to kill her, and the man who had brokered much of the arrangement, moving between courts with the patience of a professional, was a churchman, the Bishop of Beauvais, a man named Pierre Cochon, and he runs the rest of this story. Rouen, where they took her in the last days of December 1430, was the capital of English France, the headquarters of the occupation, garrisoned to the teeth, and the choice of venue announces the plan all by itself. She was to be tried by the church for heresy, and church law was explicit about what that meant for custody. A prisoner of the Inquisition belonged in an ecclesiastical prison, guarded by women, by nuns, precisely so that a female prisoner's body and soul were out of the reach of soldiers. Joan instead went into a cell in the castle of Rouen, a secular military fortress, as a military prisoner of the English crown, and she stayed there for the entire trial, and every churchman involved knew it was a violation, and she herself raised it over and over formally, on the record, asking to be moved to a church prison and to have women near her. Denied every time. The English had paid 10,000 livres, and they were not letting the merchandise out of their sight, and the arrangement they built around her instead deserves to be described slowly, since she lived inside it for 5 months. She was kept in irons, leg irons at all times, and at night, a chain locked across her body, fastening her to a great wooden beam and to her bed. And the men who did the locking were 5 English soldiers of the lowest sort, houspiliers, roughly stable grooms in soldiers' clothes, 3 of them stationed inside the cell with her, day and night, 2 more outside the door. Inside the cell, she had no privacy of any sort, sleeping and relieving herself in front of them for the whole 5 months of her imprisonment. 3 men in the room around the clock, men from an army that had been promising for 2 years to burn the witch, and who entertained themselves accordingly. They mocked her. Witnesses described them telling her she was going to die, describing it to her, and at least once staging a false announcement that her death had been decided just to watch her react. One of the trial notaries, sickened, later described the whole apparatus plainly, and beyond the mockery sat the constant physical threat, and this part the witnesses at the later investigation spoke about without much euphemism. The guards tried to rape her. More than one witness, including men with no motive to invent it, testified that her guards attempted to violate her, that she fought, that on at least one occasion her screams brought the Earl of Warwick himself, the English commander of the castle, running to the cell, and that she complained to Warwick's face about the attempts. An iron cage gets mentioned too. The castle locksmith told people he had built a cage of iron in which she was kept chained by the neck, hands and feet in the earliest weeks, before the trial sessions began, though the man repeating the story allowed that whenever he was sent to fetch her, she was out of it. Nobody who testified claimed to have watched her sitting in the thing, so the cage stands in the record as second-hand, a horror reported from 1 step away. The nightly beam and the ankle irons, on the other hand, are as solid as anything in the file. Why she clung to men's clothing in that cell has a plain answer once the room itself is in view. Her clothes were the only wall she had. The male dress of the period, hose laced to a tunic with dozens of points, cords, could be tied together into a single connected garment, and witnesses said she kept everything laced tight, all the fastenings done, so that stripping her took time and noise, the only lock she possessed being knots. Remember, this is the girl who called herself the maid, whose virginity had been examined and certified as the foundation of her whole claim, and the English, understanding this perfectly well, had her virginity examined again in Rouen on the orders of the Duchess of Bedford no less, and their own examination confirmed it, whereupon, according to later testimony, the Duchess gave orders that the guards were not to molest her. The order shows what the Duchess understood was happening in that cell, and its issuance changed by the evidence of everything that came after, approximately nothing. Illness nearly ended the whole production early. In the spring she was given a fish, scent, the the record notes by Bishop Cauchon himself, and after eating it, she collapsed into violent vomiting and fever, so severe that the English feared she was dying, and the response tells you everything about what she was to them. The best physicians available were rushed to the cell, and the Earl of Warwick told the doctors, in words one of them repeated under oath decades later, that the king would not for anything in the world have her die a natural death. The king had bought her dear, Warwick said, and she must not die except at the hands of justice, and she must be burned. Heal her, so we can kill her properly. The physicians examined her, in irons, in her cell, decided to bleed her, and Warwick fretted about that too, warning them she was cunning and might use a bleeding to kill herself. They bled her anyway, and she recovered, and one of those doctors, Guillaume de la Chambre, carried the memory of that consultation for 25 years and put it into the record at the first opportunity, along with his admission that he had signed portions of the trial documents under duress, afraid of what refusal would cost him. He wasn't guessing at the danger. 2 churchmen who objected to the proceedings early on, Jean Loyer and Nicolas de Houppeville, were threatened for it, one fleeing Rouen for his safety, the other briefly imprisoned, with talk of drowning him. Attendance at this trial for the clergy of Rouen was not entirely optional, and honest opinions about it were dangerous to hold. The man running all of it, Pierre Cauchon, repays a close look, and he never stops being a churchman-shaped instrument of state. University of Paris trained, a genuinely brilliant academic in his day, he had attached himself to the Burgundian and then the English cause decades earlier, helped negotiate the very treaty that disinherited Charles, and collected the rewards, a bishopric, a councillor's position with the English regency, a pension. Joan's armies had chased him out of his own diocese of Beauvais, so he had a personal grievance, and he also had an ambition everyone at the time could see, the vacant archbishopric of Rouen, in English gift. Convicting the witch was his audition. Formally, this needed to look like a pious, careful church inquiry, and enormous effort went into the looking. Cauchon assembled dozens of assessors, theologians and lawyers, many from the University of Paris, itself fiercely pro-English, and the trial record was kept meticulously by notaries precisely so that Europe could be shown a fair proceeding. The English paymasters sat just off stage and sometimes on it. Warwick's men guarded the doors. Assessors who spoke too generously toward the prisoner were shouted at, warned, or invited to leave, and the Vice-Inquisitor of France, whose participation was legally required to make any of it valid, spent weeks trying to squirm out of attending, pleading jurisdictional doubts, until pressure was applied, and even then witnesses described him as a man visibly serving under fear. Strip the ceremony away, and the mechanism was simple. An occupying army had bought a teenage girl and hired one court to produce one verdict, and to make the coronation of Charles VII retroactively the work of the devil. Her conviction was the point. Her guilt was a work order. She faced them for the first time in public session on February 21st, 1431, and the mismatch on paper could not have been more absurd. On one side, some of the most credentialed minds in Europe. On the other, an illiterate 19-year-old without counsel or advocate, denied both despite asking, sick, chained nightly, interrogated after months in that cell, and the sessions themselves designed for exhaustion, hours long. Questions fired by multiple examiners at once, in no order, jumping decades and doctrines mid-sentence, circling back to catch contradictions. The notaries complained they could not follow the crossfire well enough to record it. She, somehow, followed it. "You gentlemen are asking me things I answered 8 days ago," she would say. "Ask the record." She scolded them for interrupting one another. She told one persistent questioner, in effect, that if he wasn't careful with his questions, she'd have his profession. And her answers, taken down verbatim by men working for her enemies, turned the trial record into a literary classic. Under those conditions, this unlettered girl produced some of the most quoted sentences of the entire Middle Ages. The most famous came early, and it was designed as a death trap. Did she know herself to be in God's grace? Church doctrine held that no one could know such a thing with certainty, so a yes convicted her of presumption and heresy, while a no was a confession that her voices were not from God. A room full of doctors of theology waited. "If I am not," she said, "may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." One of the assessors later admitted the questioners were stupefied, and the court adjourned shortly after. Elsewhere in the transcript, she is by turns blunt, funny, and eerily calm. Asked whether Saint Michael appeared to her naked, a question asked with a smirk you can hear across 6 centuries, she answered, "Do you think God has not the wherewithal to clothe him?" Asked whether her saints hated the English, she said they loved what God loved and hated what God hated. Asked whether God hated the English, she said she knew nothing of that, but that the English would be driven out of France, dead or otherwise. Warned that she risked the fire, she told them she would say no more even if they tore her limb from limb. And once, when the questioning pressed her about her king's secret, she simply announced she had asked her counsel and would not answer. Passez outre, move on, a prisoner in chains directing the traffic of her own heresy trial. And through all of it runs a quieter thread the record preserves without meaning to. The moments where the 19-year-old shows through, when she asks to hear Mass and is refused, every request for months, no Mass, no communion, a girl whose entire life had been the sacraments cut off from all of them as a pressure tactic. And when she says, in the middle of everything, that if she were condemned and saw the fire and the faggots lit and the executioner ready, she would still say nothing different and would maintain it until death. 70 charges were eventually distilled into 12 articles, and the distillation itself was an act of quiet fraud. Summaries that rephrased her answers into more damnable shapes, sent out to the university faculties for learned opinions with her actual words left behind. Sorcery and witchcraft, prominent in the opening churn of accusations, mostly fell away for lack of anything to hang them on, and what remained centered on 2 things. Her voices, insofar as she refused to submit their judgment to the church on earth, meaning to the very men trying her and the clothes. The men's clothes, worn continuously, the charge sheet insisted, against divine law, against scripture, an abomination. And she kept telling them, in session after session, why the clothes stayed on, that she was among men, that it was necessary while she was in the hands of soldiers, and the answer went into the record and made no difference whatsoever, since the men writing the record walked past her cell to get to court. On May 9th, they escalated. She was taken from her cell to the great tower of Rouen Castle, into a room where the instruments were already laid out, and the executioner Thérage stood ready beside them, and torture was formally proposed to her, shown to her, the rack and the rest of the apparatus in front of her, while learned men explained they were prepared to put her to it, to recover the truth for the health of her soul. Truly, she told them, if you were to tear me limb from limb and separate soul from body, I would tell you nothing more. And if I did say something under it, afterward I would say you had dragged it out of me by force. Nothing extracted would be worth anything, and she said it looking at the machinery. The judges withdrew and voted, and torture was set aside by 11 votes to 3. A decision that gets called mercy, though the bookkeeping behind it sits in plain sight. A confession under torture would look forced, and this trial existed to be shown to Europe. 3 of the assembled churchmen, for the record, did vote to rack her. One of them argued it would be good for her soul. What torture could not produce, staged despair nearly did. On May 24th, she was brought out of the castle for the first time in months, into daylight, and driven by cart to the cemetery of the Abbey of Saint-Ouen, where 2 platforms had been built, one for the judges and prelates, one for her, with a crowd assembled, and waiting in plain view, the executioner with his cart ready, she was given to understand, to take her directly to the stake that same hour. A preacher named Guillaume Erard delivered a public sermon over her, and when he moved from her sins to her king, calling Charles a heretic who had hung his cause on a discredited woman, she interrupted him in front of everyone, chained, exhausted, 1 hour from the fire by her own understanding, to defend the man who had abandoned her. "By my faith, sir," she called out, "saving your reverence, I dare say and swear on pain of my life that my king is the noblest Christian of all Christians, and that he is not what you say." Erard shouted at the officials to make her be quiet. The king in question, at that moment, was several hundred miles away, doing nothing whatsoever on her behalf, and had been doing it for a year. Then came the pressure. The formal sentence began, sentence of death by fire, and while the words rolled out over her, clergy crowded around the platform urging her to submit, to abjure, to sign, and the record of these minutes is chaos, stones apparently thrown, shouting, an English chaplain screaming at Cauchon that he was favouring the prisoner, Cauchon throwing the papers down in fury. Joan, 19, ill and standing in front of an actual executioner's cart, broke. She said she would hold all that the church ordained, and a short document of abjuration was produced and recited over her, and she, unable to make out a word of it, repeated its formulas and signed it with a cross or a circle, laughing at one point, witnesses said. A strange, cracked laugh no one present managed to interpret with confidence. She later insisted the paper she agreed to was a few lines, that she had abjured only under threat of the fire, and that she had not understood herself to be denying her voices. And here the file itself grows shady, since the abjuration text preserved in the official record runs pages long. A full detailed renunciation, and one of the trial's own notaries later swore the document in the record was different from whatever was on that platform. Sleight of hand, in the middle of a sentencing, with the fire as leverage. Her sentence was commuted on the spot to perpetual imprisonment, on bread of sorrow and water of anguish, the formula ran, and she asked for the one concrete thing the whole abjuration had seemed to promise: transfer to a church prison where women would guard her. Cochon answered from the platform. "Take her back," he said, "to the place from which you brought her. Back to the castle, back to the same cell, the same beam, the same chains, the same 5 men, except now she went back stripped of the one defense she had, since abjuring meant obeying, and obeying meant the male clothes came off. They shaved her head, put her in a dress, and returned her to the room with the soldiers. What happened in that cell over the following 3 days produced the testimony that is genuinely hard to sit with. The guards, witnesses said, tormented her worse after the abjuration than before, and by several accounts, the assaults on her stopped being attempts. The bailiff of the trial, Jean Massieu, a man who escorted her daily and had no reason to invent horrors, testified about the morning of Trinity Sunday, May 27th. She asked her guards to unchain her so she could rise and relieve herself, and one of them pulled away her dress, the woman's dress she was now legally required to wear, and emptied the sack containing the old male clothes onto her bed, and took the dress away. She asked for it back. She reminded them, sirs, you know it is forbidden me, without the dress I cannot rise. The negotiation, if you can call it that, ran until noon, a chained prisoner arguing for hours with the men holding her only garment, until her body's needs ended the argument and she put on what they had left her. So runs Massieu's version. A friar who spoke with her herself in her last days recorded the other, worse version from her own mouth, that a great English lord entered the cell and tried to take her by force, and that this, the attempted rape, was the true reason she resumed the forbidden clothes, the laced hose, the tied points, the knots, the only armor left. Both versions circulated among the men who had been inside the process, and they aren't mutually exclusive, and either way the mechanics of the relapse are on the record. Wearing the clothes meant death. Someone made sure the clothes were what she had. On May 28th, Cochon and his colleagues arrived at the cell to inspect the relapse in person and found her dressed as a man and asked their questions for the file. She answered that she had taken the clothes back because it was more lawful, being among men, and that promises to her had not been kept. Mass, communion, release from irons, women guards, none of it. And then she said the rest, that her voices had come back to her, that Catherine and Margaret had spoken, that God had made known to her through them the great pity of the treason she had consented to in order to save her life, that she had damned herself to stay alive. Everything she had said at Saint-Ouen, she told them, she had said from fear of the fire. Cauchon had what he needed. A relapsed heretic in the law was finished, no second abjuration possible, the church's arm exhausted, the secular fire mandatory, and as the bishop left the castle he passed the Earl of Warwick and a knot of Englishmen waiting in the courtyard for the news, and several witnesses recorded the greeting he threw them, laughing in the open. "Farewell," he called. "Be of good cheer. It is done." She learned the manner of her death on the morning of the execution itself, from 2 friars sent at dawn to prepare her, Martin Ladvenu among them, and until that conversation she seems to have held on to her voice's promise of deliverance, still hoping, she admitted, for rescue, for some great victory, right up until a friar in her cell explained that deliverance today meant the stake. The composure that had survived a year of everything else came apart. "Alas," she cried, "according to the men in the room, am I to be treated so horribly and cruelly that my whole body, never yet corrupted, must today be consumed and turned to ashes?" She said she would rather be beheaded 7 times than burned. She tore at her hair. She appealed to God, the great judge, against the wrongs done to her. And into the middle of this walked, of all people, Pierre Cauchon, come to observe, and she turned on him with the accusation that the later investigation preserved word for word. "Bishop, I die through you." He offered his formula, that she died as a relapse. She answered that if he had put her in the church's prisons, with church guards, none of it would have happened, and called him to answer for it before God. Then, with the morning moving on, she asked for confession and communion, and here even the machine hiccuped, since a relapsed heretic had no right to the sacraments, and Cauchon, asked what to do, allowed it. Communion for a woman his own court had just cut off from the church, a concession so legally incoherent that people have argued about his motive ever since. The host was brought, by one account carelessly at first, without stole or candles, and the friar objected until it was brought again with reverence. And she received communion weeping in her cell, in irons, and shortly after, they dressed her for the fire. The Vieux Marché, the old market square of Rouen, had been prepared overnight, and the cruelty in the preparations was deliberate down to the smallest detail. 3 platforms stood in the square, for the judges, for the prelates and preacher, and for her, and beside them the pyre, and everyone who described that pyre described the same feature. It was built abnormally high, a great bed of wood raised on a base of plaster, with the stake towering at the top, and the effect of the height was understood by the professionals immediately. An executioner's customary mercy in a burning was to get close through the smoke and strangle the condemned before the flames did their work, or to pile the fire so the smoke took them fast. Built high, the pyre kept Therage away from her, and kept the flames slow to climb, and gave the crowd an unobstructed view for as long as possible. Therage himself said afterward that the height had made it impossible to dispatch her, and that she could not be put out of her pain. 800 English soldiers ringed the square, and the crowd packed every window and roof. And about 8 in the morning the cart brought her in, dressed in a long shift, her shaved head under a paper mitre on which her crimes had been written. Heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater, and a placard raised before the scaffold repeated the inventory for anyone who could make it out. She wept in the cart. Massieu rode with her, and the friar Ladvenu, and along the route, by one persistent account, a man pushed through to the cart, a priest named Nicolas Loiseleur, who had spent the trial as Cauchon's mole, posing in her cell as a friendly fellow prisoner and secretly channeling her confidences to her judges, with observers listening at a spy hole. He tried to reach the cart, weeping to beg her pardon, and English soldiers drove him off, and he had to be hustled out of Rouen for his own safety. Even the informers were cracking. She listened to one last sermon in the square, and then Cauchon delivered the final sentence, casting her out of the church as a rotten limb, and handing her to the secular arm, and here the machinery skipped its last legal step in plain daylight. The secular authorities were supposed to pass their own sentence, the civil judgment condemning her to death, since the church, formally, killed no one. No civil sentence was ever pronounced. The bailiff of Rouen, by the account of the notary Manchon and others, simply waved his hand at the waiting men and said, "Take her away, take her away." And on that gesture, and nothing else, the executioner took custody. She was burned, in the strict legal sense, on no sentence at all. While the officials arranged themselves, she knelt and prayed aloud, asking forgiveness of everyone, asking everyone to forgive her, begging the priests present each to say a mass for her soul, and the effect on the square was recorded by the men who watched it. Weeping spread through the crowd and onto the judge's platform itself, and several of the churchmen who had condemned her either wept where they sat or got up and left because they could not watch, and English soldiers stood in a ring around all of it, some laughing, some not, waiting for the clergy to be done, muttering. One account says that the priests meant to make them dine in Rouen too late. She asked for a cross. An English soldier, one of the men standing guard, took a stick, broke it, tied the 2 pieces into a rough cross, and handed it up to her, and she kissed it and put it inside her shift, against her chest. Whatever that man had shouted at the walls of Orléans, whatever he had said in the taverns about the witch, in the last minutes he made her a cross, and she carried his sticks into the fire. She asked also for a proper crucifix, and Massieu sent to the nearest church, Saint-Sauveur on the square, and the processional cross was brought, and she embraced it, and asked that it be held up before her eyes, level with her face, so the cross would be the last thing she saw through the smoke. Isambard de la Pierre took it, and climbed with it, and held it up, and stood so close to the pyre as the fire caught that she herself, from inside the flames, told him to step back, to get himself and the cross clear, and to keep holding it high where she could see it. Burning to death, she was managing the safety of the man comforting her. Then they chained her to the stake, high on the plaster platform above the square, and Thirage set the fire. Nobody who has not seen a body burn can honestly claim to know the next quarter hour. and the mechanics are documented well beyond her case. Fire kills slowly when it is allowed to. The heat blisters and splits the skin first, the pain of it beyond anything the body is built to process. And death, when it comes mercifully, comes from the smoke, the airways scorched, the lungs filling, consciousness fading before the flames do their gross work. Her pyre had been designed to keep the smoke thin and the fire's climb slow. What the crowd heard, and every account agrees on this, was her voice. She called on her saints, on Michael by name, and above everything, continuously on the name of Jesus. Witnesses counting it repeated over and over as the flames rose, and the last word anyone heard from her cried out, the accounts say, in a great voice as her head finally dropped, was Jesus. L'Advenu and Isambard stood in the heat with the cross up until the end. Most of the square by then was weeping, English and French alike. The secretary of the King of England, a man named Jean Tressart, walked away from the execution groaning, in the hearing of witnesses, that they were all ruined, for they had burned a good and holy person. An English soldier who had sworn loudly that he would personally add a faggot to the witch's fire did exactly that, threw his wood on the pyre as she was dying, and then heard her cry the name of Jesus and collapsed on the spot and had to be carried into a tavern, where he revived and swore he had seen a white dove fly out of the flames as she died. And Thérage, the professional, finished the day in the friary, shaking, telling L'Advenu and Isambard that God would never pardon him, that she had cried to Jesus in the fire, that he had burned a saint. The fire had one more job, and its handling that afternoon left no doubt about what the English understood they had created. Once she was dead, on orders, Thérage raked the burning wood back and pulled the fire apart, exposing her body, charred, half destroyed, hanging in its chains, and the crowd was made to file past and look, so that no one in France could ever claim the maid had slipped away and some other body had burned. Every witness understood the display's second function too. The maid's whole legend stood on her virgin body, and the crowd was shown that body naked and ruined, a last insult administered to a corpse. Then the wood was piled back and the fire relit, and when that burning was done, it was relit a second time. Oil and sulphur and charcoal fed into it. 3 burnings in all, hours of work, to reduce a small 19-year-old to something that could never be venerated. Even so, a story came out of that afternoon and would not die, carried, tradition says, by the executioner himself, that among the ashes the heart was found whole, unburned, full of blood by one telling, and that no quantity of oil or sulphur thrown on it would make it catch. Modern forensic specialists will tell you that hearts and viscera, dense and waterlogged, reliably resist fire and turn up intact in cremations and fire deaths all the time, and the men of 1431 had no such framework, and so the organ that would not burn meant what it meant to them. Whatever was or wasn't found in the embers, the disposal order covered everything. All of it, ash, char, and anything the fire had refused, was gathered up and carried to the bridge and thrown into the Seine, the same river that had swallowed Glasdale, so that no grave or relic of her would ever exist anywhere. Her mother could not bury so much as a finger bone. To this day, the only physical traces of Joan of Arc on this earth are ink, her answers in the registers, a few letters, and 3 of them signed in enormous, wobbling schoolchild letters by a hand just learning to hold a pen, Jahane. In the days after, the English government behaved like a regime that knew it had a problem. Letters went out from the young King's Council to the princes of Europe and the prelates of France, explaining at length that a false prophetess, a superstitious sorceress in men's clothing, had been justly examined and justly punished. And the University of Paris wrote its own round of justifications, and governments that feel secure about a verdict rarely spend this much parchment defending it. A preacher was sent into Paris to explain to the public that the woman had been a fraud from childhood, and the anonymous Parisian diarist who wrote down the sermon also wrote down without comment that opinions in the city were divided, some saying she had been a martyr, others not, and that people muttered. Rumors moved. Within a few years they took physical form, and in 1436 a woman appeared in Lorraine claiming to be Joan, escaped from the fire, and here the story tips briefly into farce. This woman, remembered as Claude des Armoises, was received by people who had known Joan, including, remarkably, Joan's own brothers, Pierre and Jean, who accepted her, or at least travelled with her and profited from her for a stretch of years. She married a knight, went about armed and in men's clothes, drank and danced with soldiers, and in 1439 came to Orléans itself, where the city that owed Joan everything gave her a reception and a gift of money for the good she had done during the siege. The city's accounts also show that in the same period Orléans stopped paying for the annual memorial mass for Joan's soul, presumably on the reasonable grounds that you don't say requiems for a woman who just attended dinner. It unravelled eventually. By 1440 she had confessed the imposture, reportedly before the king himself, and the memorial masses resumed, and the whole episode survives as a measure of something real, that a decade after Rouen, people wanted her back badly enough to accept a counterfeit, brothers included. The real reckoning had to wait for the war, and the war finally turned. Charles VII, whatever his failings toward the living Joan, grew into a competent king with a professional army, and in 1449 his forces took Rouen itself, and the king who had lifted no finger for her in 1430 now stood in the city that held her trial record, with a personal problem gnawing at him in plain view. His crown had been won by a convicted, relapsed, burned heretic, and every enemy he had could say so. So an inquiry opened in 1450, and its first 7 witnesses, the trial's own notaries and friars, Manchon, Massieu, Ladvenu, Isambard among them, gave the testimony that has been quoted throughout this video, and the picture they drew of the trial's inner workings was so ugly that the inquiry was quietly paused while the politics were arranged. Rome had to be brought in, and was, and in 1455 a full appeal opened under papal authority. And it opened with a scene in Notre Dame de Paris that deserves its place in the story. Isabelle Romée, Joan's mother, by then in her late 60s and living on a small pension in Orléans, came before the papal commissioners in the cathedral, holding the petition, supported by her surviving sons, and made the formal complaint of a mother. She had raised her daughter in the faith and the fear of God, she said, and certain men had dragged the girl through a corrupt trial and burned her, wickedly, iniquitously. And as she spoke, she broke down so completely, sobbing before the judges while the crowd around her wept and cried out with her, that the commissioners had to suspend the session. 24 years she had carried it. The court gave her the trial her daughter never got. The investigation that followed was enormous. Sworn depositions from about 115 witnesses gathered across every landscape of Joan's life. The old neighbours of Domrémy remembering the girl at the spinning wheel, the soldiers of Orléans and the Loire, now aging captains, the clergy of Rouen with their consciences and their excuses, and on July 7, 1456, in the Archbishop's palace at Rouen, the verdict came down. The trial of 1431 was declared null, void, without value or effect, tainted by fraud, calumny, iniquity, and manifest errors of law. The 12 articles convicting her denounced as corrupt summaries that had falsified her words, and a copy of the old trial record was ceremonially torn apart before the crowd. The judgment ordered a cross raised in the Vieux Marché on the spot, and processions and sermons, and so, 25 years after the fire, Rouen watched the church formally announce that it had burned an innocent, faithful Catholic. Punishment for the men responsible was, in total, nothing. Most were dead. The rest kept their offices and their pensions, and one of the assessors who had voted her to the stake had since risen to be a bishop and served, with no apparent discomfort, on the appeal that cleared her. Cauchon himself never had to watch any of it. The Archbishopric of Rouen, the prize the trial was meant to buy, went to another man, and Cauchon was shuffled to the lesser see of Lisieux, where he spent his last decade as English France collapsed around his patrons. On the 18th of December 1442, while his barber was shaving him, his heart stopped, and he died in the chair, suddenly, unabsolved of anything, and posterity has been supplying the moral of that scene ever since. Stories accumulated afterward that he was posthumously excommunicated, that an outraged populace later dug him up and threw his body in a sewer, and when his tomb at Lisieux was actually opened in 1930, the skeleton was lying there undisturbed, a tall old man with, the examiners noted, a face of striking severity, still wearing what remained of his episcopal ornaments. The sewer belonged to wishful thinking, and the chair and the razor to the record. Joan's family line carried forward through her brothers under the noble name du Lys. Her mother lived to see the verdict of 1456 and died 2 years later, and Joan herself passed into the centuries as the property of everyone, poets, kings, revolutionaries, novelists, and finally, formally, the church that had burned her. The process took its time. French bishops petitioned Rome in 1869. She was declared venerable in 1894, beatified in St. Peter's in 1909, and on May 16, 1920, before a crowd of tens of thousands and a delegation from a French republic freshly bled white by another war against another invader, Pope Benedict XV canonized her. Saint Joan of Arc, Virgin. officially a saint of the very church whose tribunal had handed her to the fire, and in 1922 she was declared a patroness of France itself. Her feast day is May 30th, the anniversary of the morning in the marketplace. Modern medicine has circled her for well over a century, and the case file stays open. Neurologists have proposed a rare form of epilepsy affecting the hearing centers of the brain, noting that her voices sometimes arrived on the sound of church bells, a pattern that fits certain seizure disorders with uncanny neatness. And other specialists have answered that people with that condition rarely also see figures, embrace them and smell them, as she swore she did. A pair of physicians once proposed tuberculosis reaching the brain from infected cow's milk, forming a growth that generated the visions. And critics replied that a girl with a tubercular brain lesion does not typically campaign on horseback in 60 pounds of armor for 18 months. One historian remarking dryly that if unpasteurized milk produces military genius, the drink deserves more credit than it gets. Schizophrenia gets raised and runs into her trial performance. Weeks of relentless interrogation met with answers so organized that her enemies' own notaries preserved them admiringly. Every diagnosis has to work from a transcript written by men trying to kill her, and that's the permanent problem. So each generation of doctors examines the same few hundred pages, and she keeps her secret, the way she kept her kings. One last artifact remains to be dealt with, and it makes a fitting place to stop. In 1867, in the attic of a Paris pharmacy, a jar turned up bearing a handwritten label. Remains found under the stake of Joan of Arc, Virgin of Orléans. Inside lay a blackened human rib, fragments of wood, a scrap of linen, and, oddly, a cat's thigh bone, folded into the story easily enough, for a black cat thrown on a witch's pyre was a practice people believed in. The church took custody, the jar went to a museum at Chinon, and in 1909, the year of her beatification, scientists examined it and pronounced it highly probable that these were her true remains, and for a century, France possessed, after all, a piece of her. Then, in 2006, a forensic pathologist named Philippe Charlier got permission to look properly and assembled a battery of modern laboratory techniques along with 2 consultants nobody expected, professional perfumers, from the great houses, brought in to smell the remains. The noses reported vanilla. Vanillin is a signature of slow bodily decomposition, the chemistry of a corpse that rotted, and a body consumed by fire has no opportunity to rot. The carbon dating landed the final surprise, placing the human rib somewhere between the 6th and 3rd centuries before Christ, roughly 2,000 years before Joan, and under the microscope the black coating on the bones held embalming resins, bitumen, and the pine pollens of Mediterranean mummification, with no trace of char anywhere. The relic of St. Joan was a fragment of an Egyptian mummy, some 2,000 years too old, dressed up, most likely in the 19th century, from the ground-up mummy stock that apothecaries of that era actually kept in jars as medicine, which returns everything in the end to the water under the bridge at Rouen. The instructions of 1431 were carried out in full, and they held. Nothing of her was ever kept. The river took all of it, and what France has been holding on to ever since is exactly what her judges could not burn: several hundred pages of a 19-year-old's answers, and a name signed 3 times in a child's careful hand. And that's where I'll leave you tonight. If you made it all the way here, honestly, respect, and tell me in the comments what part of her story you'd never heard before. I'm curious. Enormous thanks to the Patreon crew and the YouTube members for keeping the lights on around here. And if you want in, everything's linked below in the description and the pinned comment. Subscribing is free and helps more than you'd guess. Go get some sleep, be good to each other, and I'll catch you in the next one.